Neanderthal DNA in locations fundamental to our immune system.
And what first drew me into it was Denisova Cave in Siberia. I think everybody's heard of the Neanderthals, and these days I think everybody's heard of the Denisovans as well.
What if everything you thought you knew about Neanderthals was wrong, or at least incomplete? For years, they've been painted as our primitive, extinct cousins. The kind you imagine hunched over in cold caves, swinging clubs, grunting through a life of survival.
Frozen cave, 50,000 years ago. The firelight flickers across stone walls, and beside you sits someone with a heavy brow, powerful shoulders, and eyes not so different from yours.
But the real story, it's far more layered and way more personal. Thanks to the power of ancient DNA, scientists are finally uncovering the true origin of Neanderthals, and the revelations are reshaping our entire understanding of human evolution. This isn't just about digging up old bones anymore.
For centuries, they've been called brutes. Dim, doomed, a failed experiment of evolution. But now, ancient DNA tells another story.
It's about uncovering ancient relationships, tracing hidden migrations, and discovering that some of those Neanderthal genes, they're still walking around inside us. That's right. You may be more Neanderthal than you think. In this video, we're breaking down 12 incredible, research-backed truths about where Neanderthals came from, how they evolved, and how deeply connected they are to our story. These are not just facts from a textbook. These are the kind of findings that make you stop, rethink everything, and look at the past and your place in it through a whole new lens. Let's get into it. Neanderthals weren't the dull, witted cavemen most of us grew up imagining. That stereotype, the stooped posture, the grunts, the clubs, couldn't be further from reality. Modern research has revealed that Neanderthals were intelligent, resourceful, and emotionally complex beings who thrived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. They lived across Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years, a span of time longer than modern humans have even existed so far. Their lives were anything but primitive. They used fire with precision, crafted advanced stone tools, and wore clothes made from animal hides. Archaeological evidence shows that they built shelters, cared for the sick and injured, and may have even practiced symbolic behaviors like burying their dead, something once thought to be uniquely human. And they weren't physically beasts either. Their shorter, stronger bodies were perfectly adapted for cold climates, and their brains were actually larger on average than ours. The biggest surprise, though, came when scientists sequenced their DNA. That was the moment the wall between us and them began to crumble. It turns out Neanderthals weren't just neighbors. They were relatives. They interbred with early Homo sapiens, leaving a genetic fingerprint that still exists in people today. Traits like skin tone, immune response, and even how we process sunlight can all trace back to those Ice Age encounters. So, who were the Neanderthals? Not a failed experiment in evolution, but one of its greatest survivors. Their story isn't separate from ours. It's the beginning of it. For centuries, the only way we understood Neanderthals was through fossils, stone tools, and scattered clues from the ground. We knew where they lived, roughly when they existed, and how they physically differed from us. But everything changed in 2010. That's when scientists, for the first time in history, successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome using DNA extracted from a 40,000-year-old bone found in a cave in Croatia. And just like that, we had a time machine. Not one made of metal and wires, but one made of genetic code. This breakthrough gave researchers something fossils never could: access to their biology, their evolution, and even their relationships with us. By comparing Neanderthal DNA to modern human DNA, scientists quickly discovered something shocking. People outside Africa carry traces of Neanderthal ancestry. Around 1 to 2% of the DNA in modern Europeans, Asians, and their descendants comes directly from Neanderthals. That's not just a distant cousin, that's a direct branch in the family tree. But the DNA revealed more than just shared heritage. It showed when Neanderthals and modern humans likely interbred, around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, and even hinted at multiple episodes of mixing across time and geography. It also helped identify specific genes inherited from Neanderthals that still influence how we respond to disease, how our bodies process fat, and how our skin adapts to climate. Ancient DNA cracked the story wide open. It turned Neanderthals from evolutionary footnotes into active players in our own history. And it showed that the past isn't locked away in museums. It's written in us. Every genome sequence pulled from ancient bones is a message from the past, and we're finally learning how to read it. When scientists started piecing together the Neanderthal genome, they expected a few surprises, but what they found completely rewrote our understanding of the human family tree. For a long time, the assumption was simple Homo sapiens and Neanderthals split from a common ancestor, went their separate ways, and never looked back. But the DNA told a much more tangled story, one with overlapping branches, shared roots, and more than a few unexpected reunions. Genetic analysis shows that Neanderthals didn't just exist alongside modern humans. They met us, lived among us, and interbred with us multiple times. This wasn't a one-off event. It happened in waves across thousands of years in different regions. And the result is that most non-African humans today carry about 1–2% Neanderthal DNA. That might sound like a small number, but when you zoom out across billions of people, it means millions of us are walking around with a living connection to Neanderthals in our own bodies. But the surprises didn't stop there. Scientists also discovered another mysterious group, the Denisovans. Found through genetic analysis of a pinky bone in a Siberian cave, Denisovans were a close cousin of Neanderthals. And they, too, interbred with modern humans. Even more fascinating, some Neanderthals show signs of Denisovan ancestry as well, meaning these archaic humans weren't just coexisting. They were forming a web of relationships across continents. So our human story isn't a straight line. It's a braided stream of interconnection. Our ancestors didn't just replace the Neanderthals. They joined them, loved them, raised children with them. We didn't outcompete them into extinction. We merged. The truth is, our family tree has a lot more branches than we ever imagined, and Neanderthals are right there in the mix. Long before Neanderthals and Homo sapiens ever crossed paths, something big happened, a major evolutionary split. Scientists believe that somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 years ago, a common ancestor gave rise to two distinct branches, one that would become modern humans and another that would become Neanderthals. This moment, what many call the Great Eurasian Divergence, marked the beginning of a long, winding evolutionary journey that would eventually lead to us meeting and mixing. Neanderthals moved north and west, settling into Europe and parts of Western Asia. Meanwhile, early Homo sapiens continued evolving in Africa. The geographic separation meant each group faced different environments, predators, and challenges. That drove them to adapt in unique ways. Neanderthals, for example, developed stocky bodies to retain heat in cold climates, and robust features built for strength and survival in Ice Age Europe. Their tools, hunting strategies, and even their brains evolved to fit that landscape. What's remarkable is that during this time, they weren't just evolving separately, they were also becoming genetically distinct, yet still similar enough to interbreed when their paths crossed again tens of thousands of years later. DNA analysis confirms that this divergence wasn't absolute. There were likely brief contact zones and early migration waves out of Africa that may have blurred the lines between species even before the famous interbreeding events around 50,000 years ago. Some researchers believe there may have been gene flow happening far earlier than we used to think. So this wasn't just a fork in the road. It was a slow drift across time and geography. The Great Eurasian Divergence didn't create two totally separate species. It created two evolving groups, running parallel paths, always within reach of reconnecting. And when they did, human history changed forever. One of the strangest things DNA has taught us is this: we're not just descended from people we can name. There are ancestors in our bloodlines we've never seen, never found in the fossil record, and may never fully identify. Scientists call them ghost lineages. Ancient human-like populations that contributed to our genes but left no clear skeletal trace. Their only footprints are buried deep in our DNA. This idea first surfaced when researchers noticed something odd in both Neanderthal and modern human genomes. Chunks of DNA that didn't seem to come from either group. These genetic sequences were different enough that they had to come from another branch of archaic humans. Ones we haven't discovered physically. Think of it like finding a great-grandparent in your family tree who appears in photos but no one knows who they were or where they came from. In Neanderthals, some of these ghost genes look like they came from an earlier human population, possibly from the Middle East or parts of Africa, suggesting that Neanderthals themselves had a more diverse genetic background than we once believed. And in modern humans, particularly in parts of Africa, similar ghost genes exist too, implying ancient interbreeding with unknown archaic species. It's a wild realization. We didn't just evolve from one neat line of ancestors. We're the product of constant mixing, with known relatives like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and with mysterious groups we still can't name. Every time we sequence a new ancient genome, there's a chance we'll uncover another ghost, another silent contributor to who we are. The past isn't just written in bones, it's encrypted in us, and sometimes the loudest stories come from those who left no trace at all. When early modern humans began migrating out of Africa, they didn't arrive in an empty world. Eurasia was already home to other human relatives, Neanderthals in the west and Denisovans farther east. For a long time, it was assumed that these ancient populations may have simply passed each other by or kept to their own. But DNA shattered that illusion. What it revealed instead is that these ancient humans met, mingled, and in many cases made families together. Crossbreeding wasn't a rare exception. It was a recurring part of human evolution. The first clear evidence came from sequencing the Neanderthal genome. Scientists discovered that nearly all modern humans of non-African descent carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. That single fact proves that interbreeding happened, and not just once. More detailed genetic studies now suggest that there were multiple episodes of interbreeding over tens of thousands of years in different regions of Europe and Asia. And then there's the Denisovans, a group identified entirely through DNA extracted from a single finger bone found in Siberia's Denisova cave. Their genome showed something wildy. Not only did they interbreed with modern humans, but they also mixed with Neanderthals. The real kicker: one ancient individual, known as Denny, turned out to be the daughter of a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. A literal hybrid child. That's not theoretical. That's biological proof of two distinct human groups having direct, reproductive contact. What's even more fascinating is how these genetic interactions shaped us. The genes we inherited from Neanderthals and Denisovans affect a wide range of modern traits, from skin tone and immune response to fat metabolism, and even how we respond to altitude. In Tibetan populations, for example, a gene variant that allows people to live in high altitudes without altitude sickness comes directly from Denisovans. It's also important to note that the interbreeding didn't only flow one way. Evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens also contributed genes back into Neanderthal populations. This exchange wasn't just a one-time encounter. It was an ongoing relationship. In some regions, Populations of humans and Neanderthals likely lived in overlapping territories for generations. So what does this all mean? It means that the lines between species weren't nearly as sharp as we thought. These groups weren't isolated tribes with strict barriers. They were human, different, yes, but compatible in every way that matters. The more we learn, the clearer it becomes. Our story isn't a neat ladder of progress. It's a network of interactions, relationships, and shared experiences across deep time. Crossroads weren't just geographic, they were genetic. And those ancient meetings still echo in every cell of our bodies today. Every now and then, science stumbles across a discovery so rare, so perfectly timed, it feels almost scripted. That's exactly what happened in 2018 when researchers working in Siberia's Denisova cave uncovered something incredible. A tiny bone fragment from a teenage girl who lived around 90,000 years ago. At first glance, it didn't look like much. But when they sequenced her genome, the results were jaw-dropping. This girl, nicknamed Denny, had a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father. She was a first-generation hybrid. This wasn't theory. It wasn't guesswork. It was confirmed, mapped, and verified by independent teams. Half her DNA matched Neanderthals. The other half matched Denisovans. Denny was the living, breathing proof that two ancient human groups, once thought to be completely separate species, not only met, but mated successfully. What makes this discovery so extraordinary is how rare it is to find such direct evidence. Fossils rarely survive the passage of deep time, and DNA survives even less often. To recover the remains of someone who was literally the product of two evolutionary lineages, that's like finding a needle in a million haystacks. Only the needle is 90,000 years old. Denny's story doesn't just confirm interbreeding, it reshapes how we think about these relationships. For one, it shows that Neanderthals and Denisovans were genetically close enough to produce fertile offspring. That challenges how we define species in the human evolutionary story. It also shows that contact between these groups wasn't always distant or sporadic. At least in some places, it was intimate. Even more fascinating is what Denny's DNA tells us about her parents. Her mother's side came from a population of Neanderthals that lived in Western Europe. Her father's side, Denisovan, had traces of Neanderthal ancestry as well, meaning that crossbreeding had happened even earlier in prior generations. Denny wasn't just the first link. She was part of a chain of connections stretching even further back. The Denisova cave, where her remains were found, is quickly becoming one of the most important prehistoric sites in the world. It's the only known location where remains of all three major human groups, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens, have been found. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a crossroads. Denny's existence is more than a genetic marvel. It's a reminder that human evolution wasn't shaped by separation, it was shaped by connection. Her story cuts through the old idea of rigid species lines and shows us something far more human. People met, bonded, and had families, regardless of the label we give them today. When you think of Neanderthals, you probably picture them hunkered down in Ice Age Europe, living in caves, rarely venturing far from home. But the more we dig, literally and genetically, the more we realize just how wrong that image is. Neanderthals weren't stationary. They moved, a lot. And one of the most fascinating genetic clues we've uncovered shows just how far their journeys took them. Across thousands of miles of unforgiving terrain. It starts in the Denisova cave in southern Siberia, the same site where Denny was discovered. Among the remains found there was a Neanderthal woman who lived over 100,000 years ago. Scientists managed to extract and sequence her genome. Then came the twist when they compared her DNA to that of other Neanderthals found in Europe. They found she was more closely related to Neanderthals from Croatia than to other Neanderthals who lived in Siberia much later. Let that sink in. A Neanderthal living in Central Asia was genetically closer to populations thousands of miles away in Europe than to her local neighbors, who arrived in the region tens of thousands of years later. That means one of two things: either her group migrated all the way from Europe into Siberia, or there were waves of Neanderthals constantly moving across continents, mixing and replacing older populations over time. This discovery shattered the idea that Neanderthal groups were isolated in small, local clusters. It painted a picture of a dynamic population, one that migrated, mixed, and responded to environmental pressures over vast stretches of land. These weren't static cave dwellers. They were travelers, explorers, and survivors. Why does this matter? Because it proves that Neanderthals had the ability, and perhaps even the cultural drive, to expand their territory. It also shows that different groups of Neanderthals weren't living in total isolation. They were likely meeting, interbreeding, and exchanging genes across regions in the same way modern humans did. In fact, many Neanderthal fossils show surprising genetic diversity, which only makes sense if their populations were mobile and interacting over long distances. This also helps explain the genetic traces of Neanderthals in modern East Asians, who carry slightly more Neanderthal DNA than Europeans. It hints that some interbreeding events likely happened further east, possibly involving migrating Neanderthal populations like the one found in Denisova cave. So next time you picture a Neanderthal, don't imagine a figure trapped in a cave. Imagine someone walking through snowy forests, climbing rocky hills, following migrating herds, and traveling with family. Someone who may have crossed mountains and rivers to shape the very genes you carry today. For years, scientists believed one thing for certain: if you had African ancestry, you didn't have Neanderthal DNA. The logic seemed solid. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia, and the major interbreeding events with Homo sapiens happened after humans migrated out of Africa. So, people whose ancestry remained rooted in Africa were thought to have missed that genetic exchange. But as it turns out, DNA had another twist in store, and this one challenged the very idea of human migration as a one-way journey. Around 2020, new research began showing that even people with deep African roots carry small but measurable traces of Neanderthal DNA. At first, scientists were baffled. How could Neanderthal genes show up in populations that never left Africa? The answer: back migration. After modern humans first left Africa and encountered Neanderthals in Eurasia, some of them, carrying newly acquired Neanderthal DNA, eventually migrated back into Africa. And when they did, they passed those genes into the gene pool. It wasn't a flood of returnees, but even small numbers of people moving back could make a noticeable difference over generations. Genetic models now show this wasn't just possible, it was almost certainly happening. This flips the migration narrative on its head. Africa wasn't just a place humans left behind. It remained a connected hub of evolutionary exchange. Populations moved out, came back in, and likely did so more than once. Africa wasn't isolated, it was active. This backflow also explains why some Neanderthal-like genes appear in modern African populations, even though no Neanderthal fossils have ever been found on the continent. The genes made the journey, even if the bones didn't. Some of these genes influence traits like immune system responses and even neurological development, reminding us again that our evolutionary legacy is still active inside us. Even more remarkably, scientists now believe that this movement of genes into Africa didn't stop with Neanderthal DNA. Other archaic lineages, including unidentified ghost populations, may have also contributed genetic material in both directions. The flow of genes was global, and it was anything but linear. The back migration story also sends a powerful message. No part of the world existed in total isolation. Populations moved, people mixed, and genes traveled across landscapes long before the idea of countries or continents ever existed. So yes, Neanderthals were mainly European and Asian, But thanks to the winding paths of migration and the remarkable reach of DNA, their legacy lives on in Africa too, not through fossils, but through the echoes in our genes. One of the biggest questions in human evolution is, when did we actually split from the Neanderthals? Not just physically, but genetically. When did our last common ancestor give rise to two separate paths? To answer that, scientists don't just look at bones or tools. They look at something much smaller: mutations in DNA. These tiny changes act like timestamps, helping us build maps of ancient relationships and migrations across deep time. Here's how it works. Every time DNA copies itself, whether in bacteria, animals, or humans, it makes occasional mistakes. These are mutations. Most are harmless, some are helpful, and others just drift through generations unchanged. But what makes them so valuable to scientists is that they accumulate at a fairly steady rate over time. That means, in theory, you can count them like tree rings. The more differences between two genomes, the longer it's been since they shared a common ancestor. When researchers compared the genomes of Neanderthals and modern humans, they found just enough mutations to estimate a divergence time of around 500,000 to 800,000 years ago. That's when the last shared population, likely a group of Homo heidelbergensis or something similar, began splitting into two. One that stayed in Africa and eventually became Homo sapiens, and one that spread into Eurasia and evolved into Neanderthals, Sekino, and later, Denisovans. But it gets even more interesting. Using mutation maps, scientists can also date when interbreeding events happened between these groups. For example, the chunks of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans are relatively long and intact, meaning they haven't had enough time to get broken up by generations of recombination. That tells us the major Neanderthal-human mixing events happened around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Even subtler genetic signals, like smaller fragments or rare variants, hint at earlier, lesser-known interbreeding events, possibly over 200,000 years ago. Some scientists believe there may have been multiple waves of contact, some leaving only faint traces in modern genomes. Mutation tracking helps detect these ancient moments, like footprints left in wet sand. This genetic clock isn't perfect. It depends on assumptions like how fast mutations occur and how populations changed over time. But with more ancient genomes being sequenced every year, the models are getting better, sharper, and more precise. We're not just guessing anymore. We're measuring. What all of this tells us is simple but profound: DNA doesn't just hold biological instructions. It holds history. And thanks to these mutation maps, we're no longer fumbling in the dark about when humans and Neanderthals diverged. We're beginning to see the whole timeline, one genetic tick at a time. As incredible as DNA has been for unlocking the Neanderthal story, genetics isn't the whole picture. Long before we could sequence ancient genomes, bones were all we had. And even now, with all our high-tech methods, the physical remains still play a crucial role in understanding who Neanderthals were, not just genetically, but socially, behaviorally, and culturally. Their skeletons speak volumes. Neanderthals had distinct physical features: broad rib cages, wide noses, heavy brow ridges, and thick, powerful bones. These traits weren't random. They were evolutionary adaptations to a cold, physically demanding environment. Shorter limbs helped conserve heat, while dense muscles and strong hands